Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have next the International Panel of Distinguished Ambassadors and Diplomats. I'm John Pilatich. I'm serving as government co-chair for the event today, and I'm in our Information and Communication Policy Office. I will now introduce my ambassador. I would like to say a few words about Ambassador Robert L. Strayer, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Cyber and International Communication and Information Policy. In this capacity, he leads on the development of international cybersecurity, internet, data, and privacy policy. And he's been in countless negotiations with different governments on these issues. He's led dozens of bilateral and multilateral delegations to various dialogues as well as conferences. He was named by the President as ambassador and head of delegation to the 90-plus large U.S. delegation we had at the International Telecommunication and Unions Plenipotentiary Conference last October 2018. In that capacity, he also served as vice chair of the conference and was able to bring home quite a few successes for the U.S. when it comes to pro-innovation results for resolutions on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And now, folks, please join me in warmly welcoming Ambassador Strayer.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me at this event. I want to thank ACT and IAC for hosting this. I also want to thank the private sector folks who did all the work at putting this together, as well as John and Adam, who've been working a lot on this, this event today. As John mentioned, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department for Cyber and International Communications Policy. At the State Department, that means I lead the office that is in charge of ensuring that we have a comprehensive strategy to address both cybersecurity threats as well as the opportunities in the digital economy. Increasingly, we've seen that our economies benefit tremendously from the innovation that we've seen in the digital space. It's been roughly 30 years since the World Wide Web was created. In that time, we followed the model of having a set of practices that were based on letting the engineers, the private sector experts, the academics determine the path forward rather than having government set the path forward for technology. That's allowed all kinds of new innovation to occur. You know, when we had the old flip phones and we were texting on those, we never foresaw the opportunities that we were going to have through smartphones and then the apps that ride on those. And we're about now to turn the page to something entirely different with the Internet of Things that won't require humans to be in the middle. We'll have machine-to-machine communications through the sensors that are on the 5G networks that we will soon see in the future. As we address any of the challenges that we see in cyberspace, we need to do those consistent with our own values. It's important that we bring the types of tools that we bring to any other transnational or international challenge to bear that we now need to do in the digital space. Key among the tools that we use are the diplomatic tools and cooperation measures that we need to have with other governments. The internet itself, of course, is inherently transnational. Anything that we do in one country from a regulatory basis almost always will have an impact that's external, that affects other countries. The same occurs with regard to cybersecurity. A threat actor in one part of the world can immediately have an impact across borders in a different part of the world. So we need inherently to have a coordination cooperation mechanism among governments. That's why this panel today is important to understand, to start to gain better understandings about how we're all facing slightly different challenges, but there's some real commonalities in the risks that we face. And it's also key that we think about how we're going to develop interoperable solutions across those borders, that we don't end up developing solutions to problems with regard to the internet that actually set up more barriers and cause a further fragmentation of the internet. As I mentioned earlier, it's really important that we think about how we do all of these tasks with our values in mind, with our values about rule of law, about human rights, about protecting individual liberties as we roll out new technologies. If I can just give one sort of case study to think about, it's the 5th generation of wireless technology. For about a year, we've been talking to governments and through their governments to the populations of people around the world about the importance of having security built into the 5th generation of wireless technology. But it's not just about the basic cybersecurity aspects, the technical aspects. It's really about thinking about what kind of vendor should be providing that kind of technology. What kind of vendor does one trust to ensure that the updates are made appropriately, that there's not a collusion between a government and its providers to undermine the rest of our security and other interests. We know there's great potential in 5G to basically supply, be the underpinning for the future of critical infrastructure. It'll help supply electricity to us, water to our homes, to provide transportation networks and autonomous vehicles. All that will be supplied by 5G. That's what makes it so critical that we have 5G secured. When we look at who we consider, though, to be trusted partners, it would be countries that have similar values to ours. In China, we have a case of a country whose values are quite divergent from what, especially in recent years, with regard to data. We've seen the Chinese government use data to assign social credit scores to people, to imprison millions of Uyghur population based on their ethnicity and their religion. So we've seen a country that is seeking to use data in ways that we would not countenance in our liberal democracies, that is contrary to our values. That is not a country that we're going to be able to trust to be part of supplying the most important infrastructure to our societies in the future. Furthermore, when we talk about our values, there's companies like Huawei in China and the Chinese government who will approach governments in countries around the world and offer them 0% interest terms for 20 years. They offer them terms that are not in any sort of way, any even close to the mark of being a reasonable commercial venture. They're also offering these contracts to governments in non-transparent ways. We know of many cases of countries that have signed up for financing deals with China for their One Belt, One Road project or other areas where they have taken on huge debt burdens that are unsustainable. In some cases, that causes countries like Sri Lanka to have to give up their port as a collateral for future payments on a loan. In the end, they lose that port to China. So that kind of model of financing is not what anyone would consider in the West to be a appropriate financing mechanism. So we're talking to governments about the values and the types of financing that should underpin the future of infrastructure, and that would, of course, include telecommunications infrastructure and the 5th generation of wireless. Lastly, I know you probably talked a little bit earlier about artificial intelligence, but that's an area where we know that it needs to be built on fundamental human rights, protecting human rights, building that into the algorithms, building that into the systems themselves so that the public and governments can understand and that there is an explainability factor built into what AI does. That way we can ensure that there's not discriminatory aspects to it, that it's not being used in ways to deny people fundamental human rights. There are, of course, countries that are already using surveillance technologies, using machine learning in ways that are contrary to the values that we hold dear. So it's important that we speak up against those, that we work with other governments around the world to ensure that the values that we embrace are going to be key components of future technologies. The last thing I want to mention is that we don't need to fall into false dichotomies as we make decisions about future technologies. For example, we can avoid data localization. We can have both security about our data and not have it localized in specific locations in countries around the world. We can still let the best architecture of the cloud with best practices applied for cybersecurity allow data to be where it needs to be around the world in the most efficient manner possible. In fact, localizing data in many cases will cause it to be housed in locations where it's less secure and more likely to be intruded upon by cyber criminals or others. So we shouldn't think that the false dichotomies need to apply to many digital choices that we're going to make. There's thoughtful ways we can move forward, but that's what often needs to be based on working with industry. We want to see voluntary industry-led standards that are ways that we deal with the challenges that we face. Lastly, to say, regarding the challenges in the field of AI and others, it's so important that we really rely on what are tangible problems that we face and not just speculation about what problems could occur in the future. we should be reluctant to regulate, because every time we regulate, we're stifling some path of innovation that would have otherwise gone forward. And of course, there's important public policy reasons that we need to address some issues, but if we work to add too much of a protective set of measures up front, we will stifle that innovation that's so important. We need to continue to see the investment, the competition that will lead to future innovation in ways that we cannot foresee today. So we're very fortunate to have this excellent panel coming forward with members of our diplomatic corps in Washington, including 3 ambassadors. So I invite them to come up here, and they're under the excellent co-chairmanship for the panel discussion with John and Kambiz. Unfortunately, I have to return to the White House for a meeting at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to leave right away. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Good to see you. Thanks a lot. Nice to meet you.
Good to see you.
So it is my honor to welcome our panel of of ambassadors and distinguished diplomats. I would like to ask His Excellency Sheikh Abdullah Khalifa, the ambassador from the Kingdom of Bahrain, for the first presentation.
Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, ACT, IAC, for providing the diplomatic community this wonderful platform and the chance to share countless experiences in the digital age. Bahrain has a story to tell, and I'm proud to be here sharing it with everyone in attendance. Bahrain has been both vigilant and bullish when it comes to integrating itself with new and emerging technologies. In fact, one thing I'm certain about is that Bahrainis are not afraid to dip their toes in the water, so to speak, to adopting innovative solutions to old age problems. Truth be told, we're not afraid to try anything new for the first time if we did not believe that our society or institutions would reap some sort of benefit. There's an intrinsic connection between economic growth and technology, and Bahrain's roles in shaping the Arab region's financial industry has been 40 years in the making. Our early endeavors in reforming an oil-dependent economy to becoming a regional financial hub shows us that Bahrain's forward-thinking policies and regulatory experience resulted in more licensed financial institutions and registered funds than anywhere in the region. Specifically, there are over 400 financial institutions operating in Bahrain, with a registration of about 3,000 authorized funds. And during the time it took for us to reach these milestones, our financial institutions underwent a sea of change by embracing technology and automation. Foreign exchange transactions, for example, have changed in both quality and execution after the introduction of software with built-in technologies and advantages over manual trading. And the significance of Bahrain's early endeavors resulted in a comparatively diversified economy, which today includes a financial sector that is second only to oil and gas in contributions to our real GDP. Therefore, the financial institutions' embrace of technology, coupled with the central bank's robust regulations and guidelines, provided Bahrain a safety net during some turbulent financial times. Nonetheless, Bahrain's economy operates in a distinctive climate that was once dominated by petrodollars and oil price fluctuations. To be direct, the government of Bahrain has made 2030 goals. The government of Bahrain has made economic diversification the cornerstone of its Vision 2030 goals, with SMEs expecting to play a significant role too. And I believe that fintech will eventually bridge the funding gap that might have hindered SME growth in the past. We're also aware that the future of the financial industry lies with fintech innovation. And currently, Bahrain is at the forefront of providing the ideal environment for a healthy fintech ecosystem. While Bahrain is progressive in supporting public and private sector funding to drive fintech development, we still maintain high regulatory and oversight standards. With robust guidelines, the Central Bank of Bahrain continuously enhances a tried and trusted regulatory framework that plays a leading role in achieving regional standardization. Therefore, the CBP created a regulatory fintech sandbox that provides a secure, virtual space that allows companies to test and develop digital banking products with flexibility. On that note, it is not surprising that the Central Bank of Bahrain recently issued one of the most comprehensive set of cryptocurrency regulations in the Middle East, which encompasses rules on licensing, governance, and risk management for this new asset class. There is no doubt that this gives Bahrain the lead in regulating this industry. One major takeaway from the new regulations is that cryptocurrency wallets run on blockchain technology are covered by insurance to protect against unlikely incidents of hacking or theft. The Central Bank of Bahrain has also released regulations for both debt and quality-based crowdfunding. One major takeaway from our crowdfunding regulations is that for the first time, it will be possible for SMEs in Bahrain and the region to raise both conventional and Islamic or Sharia-compliant financing. However, challenges do lie ahead, particularly in areas of funding in general. Access to finance is considered a key for growth, so in order to address funding gaps for fintechs and other startups, Bahrain Development Bank launched a $100 million venture capital fund of funds last year, capitalizing on Bahrain's regional position as a financial center. The fund successfully completed its first $100 million fundraising, and just last month has already allocated $50 million to numerous venture capitalists. A few years ago, you would not have heard of a fund of this size targeting private investors' support for tech-based startups in Bahrain. Bahrain has been trying to position itself as a destination with a robust legal framework for loan crowdfunding, while providing governance for fintech businesses, and most importantly, continue in its mission to protect customers. Therefore, our regulations intend to shield and aid SMEs and startups with access to alternative forms of funding, and traditional options are not available. As a result, Bahrain has approved 3 types of crowdfunding: equity, debt, and Sharia-compliant financing, which can be both debt or equity-based. As Bahrain has become a destination for fintech companies looking to enter the Middle East market, Bahrain's financial market is quickly approaching maturity. With fintech services, most notable applications span across the banking, insurance, and wealth management sectors. A few days ago, Bahrain witnessed its involvement with Silicon Valley take off, following the launch of Silicon Fintech Bay, which is a fintech corporate accelerator and startup incubation hub overseen by a partnership of investors. We now have a network of global partners in Bahrain, Singapore, Detroit, and Silicon Valley, running on a shared platform focusing on blockchain, insurance, and regulatory technology. Yet the advantages of fintech solutions are not only going to impact financial institutions, but also sectors such as telecom, manufacturing, government, and beyond. Over the last 18 months, Bahrain launched its regulatory sandbox and has taken proactive measures to encourage growth while maintaining itself as a global financial hub. The crowdfunding regulations I mentioned shows us that market regulators are not only embracing new technology, but play an important role to enhance customer experience and, more importantly, encourages financial inclusion of SMEs and/or individuals. Therefore, there's no shortage of reason why business investors have looked at Bahrain as a financial destination. We have significant advantages of a business-friendly environment with access to a deep, diverse, and talented human capital base. Bahrain is proud of its young, educated, bilingual, and tech-savvy talent. Our free trade agreement with the United States also safeguards American intellectual property rights, especially in the digital age. In addition, Bahrain's ease of entry that grants market access to the MENA market is enhanced by the kingdom's strong technical infrastructure that significantly enhances its reputation as a financial hub. In conclusion, our continued development of the fintech sector provides an opportunity for Bahrain to strengthen its wider financial services by capitalizing on its solid banking foundations. While fintech might have appeared as a complementary side note to today's banking and financial systems a few years ago, I believe that it is only a matter of time before fintech companies switch roles as facilitators and eventually become industry trailblazers. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Ambassador Khalifa. Next, it's my honor to invite Minister Arunish Chawla from the Embassy of India to give a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk about the emerging technologies, or as the policymakers now call, the fourth industrial revolution. I'm happy to share that 6 months ago, that's last year, India set up a Center for the Emerging Technologies, or Industry 4.0 as it is called. And this was a collaborative effort between the World Economic Forum and the National Institution for Transforming India, which is called the NITI Aayog. This was fourth such center globally, the other three being San Francisco, Tokyo, and Beijing. India has changed rapidly. At each stage of industrial revolution, it was a different country, unrecognizable from what it was in the past. The third industrial revolution changed India like never before. From an underdeveloped, it became an emerging economy, and now the fastest growing economy in the world. Major changes have happened in the policy landscape, in the way private sector, households, and the government interacts. Digital India has been a great success story, and one of the biggest achievements has been setting up a unique identity system which we call as Aadhaar, which in English means the foundation. This is the largest biometric system ever created in the world. More than 1 billion people are now part of it. And just carrying yourself for delivery of any services is sufficient. Building on this, India has integrated what is called the JAM. JAM means, J stands for Jan Dhan, which is creating a huge system for financial inclusion. Aadhaar means the unique ID system that has been set up. And M means the mobile, which is the smartphones of the telecom revolution. Putting together, and you can feel it when you move around India, how much this has changed India in the last decade or so. Going forward, India would contribute probably the largest share of skilled manpower and the skilled professionals that the world would need for putting the fourth generation industrial revolution in place. Indian companies are becoming global as global companies are becoming Indian. Nearly all the 500 Fortune 100, 500 companies have now a center based in India, which is involved not just in back-end operations, but now increasingly in developing new and frontier technology. With this, the integration between the global value chains will be complete, and the world that will emerge from this industrial revolution will be so different that it would be something we would never ever have seen. It would transform India right at the grassroots. We will have emergence of smart agriculture, where every farm, every field could be tailored farming and crop practices that are specific to it. We'll see smart health, where every patient will be treated for the uniqueness of his body. We'll have smart education, skill development, tailored to your individual needs. And we'll have smart cities. We already made a beginning by announcing 100 smart cities in the previous government. The government has been re-elected and the vision rolled out. We're going to move faster, further, and hands in hand with all of you and the world will be part of the change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So now, thank you, Minister Chawla. Minister Chawla and Ambassador Khalifa had meetings to go to, but now we have our panel discussion, and I'm going to ask. Is this microphone here? No? In the back? Can I get this one? Awesome. Thank you. So it is my honor to introduce and invite my Kardash, as we say in Azeri, which is brother, His Excellency Ali Suleymanov, the Ambassador of the Republic of Azerbaijan to the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
The last time I saw him happy, he was in California. He is still happy in Washington, which is a good news.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's difficult to speak after and next to the giants of such advanced countries in the field of ICTS. Singapore, Austria, of course, our good friends from Estonia, and speaking after India makes it very difficult. But I'll try. Obviously, within development of economic and social development in a nation, today digital technologies have played a very significant role. Azerbaijan, as you know, is one of the oldest oil-producing areas in the world. In fact, we have introduced industrial oil production to the world. If anybody is here from Pennsylvania, don't feel bad. I know it hurts that Pennsylvania was 8 years behind Azerbaijan, but sometimes we have to take history lessons. At the time, in 1848, drilling for oil was an emerging and a very advanced technology. In 1918, introducing tankers and pipelines for delivering the 50% of the global oil supply was also an innovation, also an emerging technology. And by the way, being the first republic in the Muslim world which granted rights to women and all the citizens regardless of their identity was also an innovation. So innovation is not necessarily just digital. Innovation is a state of mind. And why I say that, it's important, today we understand oil and gas, which have fueled our economic growth, are very fundamentally important. They remain fundamentally important. They remain the drivers of economy. But they're finite resources. We know sooner or later they're going to run out, not as soon as many people think. There's still enough. So if anybody wants to invest in the oil and gas business, don't worry, it's doing fine. But we understand the limits to that. So what do? You take that money and you try to expand it into economy in general. So Azerbaijan remains the largest economic partner of the United States in the South Caucasus. Our economy over the last 15 years grew 3 times. Of course, the driver is energy, but there's a multiplication effect which comes from that. One of the things we have done is to look back in our history and realize that the Silk Road, which connects China to Europe, goes to and Silk Road used to be silk, which was also, by the way, innovation and spices. Then it became energy. But now it's ideas and also technology. So Azerbaijan is one of the champions of the TASIM, a fiber optic connection between Europe and Asia, which is the fastest connection there. Just last week, Azerbaijani operator, Azertelecom, and Kazakhstan's operator, Kaztranscom, signed an agreement on bringing the fiber optic cable, which originates in Europe, across the Caspian Sea in Kazakhstan, and then it connects to China. Now think about this. For the first time, Trans-Caspian connection, people usually think about this in terms of oil, military equipment. For the first time, it actually is connecting those countries, and friendly countries, which matters too, because I know some of our colleagues here have been subject to a hostile abuse of our networks. So that's a good connection, and the 400 kilometers of Trans-Caspian subsea network is going to be built by 2022. In Azerbaijan, the internet user penetration rate is about 80%, and 73 of those 80% is actually broadband wireless network users. And now, this could be surprising, but one of the legacies of and that's how you turn the challenge into an opportunity. One of the legacies of the former Soviet Union, and I think my colleague from Estonia would agree with me, is that Soviets got the first man on the moon, in a space, not on the moon, in a space, but they really had bad telephone systems. It was impossible to call anywhere. I mean, you could fly to moon, but you cannot make a phone call. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were left with a pretty dysfunctional phone system, landline system. So instead of actually building the landline, what Azerbaijan has decided, and some other nations actually, that goes together, we made the leap. We right away moved to the mobile and cell systems, which basically helped to advance wireless networks to the point which are now used quite widely and is quite well established in broadband. Azerbaijan has innovation systems, incubators. We just had recently had an innovation week in Azerbaijan. In 2018, which would be an interesting example, Azerbaijan hosted the first International Innovation Week. And one of the guests there was internationally famous robot, Sophia. I'm sure you all know that. It's an example of the AI personality. It's actually very interesting. She's very human in the way that she speaks. Azerbaijan holds the distinction for granting the first ever robot visa to a robot person. So she got a visa from Azerbaijan being a robot. That's a little bit, as an ambassador for me, that's a little bit too much of a leap in terms of technology. Maybe I'm not prepared for that yet, but that's an interesting caveat. At the end of the day, however, we could talk a lot about technologies, but as a representative of a government, what I know is how does it help people? I mean, I just mentioned an example of the Soviet system, but very advanced science, advanced nuclear technology, advanced space technology. But if your TVs don't work, if there's it doesn't help you in any way, if the phones don't function, what's the point of it, right? I mean, what's the point of your development? And in that respect, I'm very proud to say that Azerbaijan has pioneered a practice which is called Asan Hidmat, and it's electronic services to the population. Basically, it's an electronic interface for services provided by the government. And trust me, if anyone here dealt with DMV, you'll be very happy, or I don't know if you're going to be happy or unhappy to hear, that I got my license renewal and passport renewal within 25 minutes in Baku. You just go in, you submit your paperwork, it's right there, it's electronic service, you pay your fee, you get your documents right there. That created an enormous impulse of positive energy, and people began looking at digital development as something which helps them. We introduced digital visas now, and we're looking at the digital distribution of land grants and all. Those are important things because that's what people want to see. Now, It was recognized by UN as a very innovative development. So Azerbaijan got, for that service, we got a UN prize for public service. And in addition to that, I'm very proud to say that is now replicated in Afghanistan with the same name. We're very much closer to each other than we ever thought. It's also called Asan Khidmat, with the E instead of the I. But they use the same system in Afghanistan. I'm very happy that we could spur not just our own development, but also contribute to development of a friendly nation which could find it useful. Now, we have spoken about this here at a number of events. We had a US-Azerbaijan startup and innovation forum in Boston. And my good friend, Ambassador Khalifa, spoke about Silicon Valley, and I know we're all biased to the Silicon Valley because of the West Coast connection, but I think the emerging technologies in the Boston area, especially around Kendall Square, have been quite innovative and in a way perhaps even ahead of its own time. That's important too. When we speak about this though, we cannot avoid the dark side of innovation and digital technologies. While they opened up enormous opportunities for all of us, they also opened up enormous opportunities as well for data theft, for identity theft. And I have to tell you very openly that unfortunately most of the radicalization of the population which leads to terrorism and violence also happens online. So I think that is where it's very difficult to find a balance. It's not just a new technology issue, it's always been there. Same with the written words, same with the normal media, same with the digital media, social networks. What do? How do you restrict it in a way which could infringe on I'm not even talking about individual assets, just infringe on development of a society as a whole? Or do you let it be uncontrolled and damage and risk growth of violence to the point of being unable to control it? So that balance is still not found. And I think if the governments don't try to address that issue, they will be obligating their own responsibility. You can't, part of the government's responsibility is to provide security for its population and do that. So we have not found an answer for this. I don't think anybody has. We're trying to address those issues, but I think a discussion like this, and I'm very grateful to organizers, to ACT and IAC for doing this, I think should also involve that kind of a conversation, because what we don't want to do is, when God forbid something bad happens, for governments or the relevant bodies to overreact to something which would be a knee-jerk reaction. So I think there should be a discussion, ongoing discussion, how to address those challenges without limiting, in this particular case, the growth and the positive contribution of the new technologies to the government's work. Anyway, I've spoken for way too long. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'll stay here for a while.
Yes, that's great.
If I could get the mic, maybe? This one, please. Hello, testing. Thank you, Your Excellency. Allow me to give the floor to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Singapore, Ashok Mupuri.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here to join all of you. And I was very happy to be invited to a panel like this, because in many ways, it is the collaboration that takes place. It is no longer just national issues that give us the opportunities in technology. It is collaboration that takes place. As you heard my other colleagues, and you will hear from the other colleagues, each country looks at it in very different sectors and areas of interest and what we're trying to do. For Singapore, the whole idea of technology is really going to be the next leap forward in many ways. Many of you may not be familiar with Singapore, but we are a highly constrained society in terms of land and population. Because of our land size, we're about 2 times the size of Washington, D.C., a population that has got a limited growth capacity, and therefore technology really gives us that opportunity to make that next leap forward. The land constraint is also provides some opportunities because it does mean you can invest in infrastructure. So 9 out of 10 homes in Singapore have access to broadband because we don't have rural populations, and that makes it a lot easier. Also, we're fortunate to have a well-educated population, a very wired population, and people do have access to technology. But we've allowed this technology to come forward in many ways. But 5 years ago, we launched something called the Singapore Smart Nation Initiative. I want to outline a little bit of this Smart Nation Initiative, and then we can take up questions in particular areas that you may be interested in. Because we wanted to look more comprehensively at how do you use technology in building up this smart nation. The objective, as my friend from Azerbaijan said, is in the end to serve the citizens. It's not technology for the sake of technology. It is about the citizens, it is about businesses, and helping them through better technology in order to achieve their futures. So we've looked at 3 broad areas in terms of what will transform the economy through technology. The first, obviously, is the digital economy. Very obvious, businesses come in, multinational comes in, business come in, and look at the economic drivers of growth and competitiveness. I think that's quite important to understand that where traditionally our economic drivers may have been land and labor, there is a new driver of growth through technology. And we want to be able to harness the digital economy for the future. In Singapore, this has to be supported by the government because the government has to lay out the regulatory framework. So we have a whole digital government approach as well. Not just providing e-services to people and you can file your taxes online, you can apply for all sorts of services online. We want to make that a lot easier for people, but also using the government as a regulatory area in terms of laying out the framework for the smart nation. And the third area, obviously the one that links most people together, is that digital society. To ensure that all segments, and by all I mean, it doesn't mean whether you're just a young millennial who has access to technology, it's also the older people who may be somewhat uncertain about how technology is used, to make them harness and be able to benefit from this digital technology. So this is a big challenge, even in a small population of 5.5 million people. There are several national projects that we have identified because that will give you a sense of sort of the pillars that we're looking at. The first, obviously, I think you need this for any sort of digital government, is a digital national identity. How do we frame up and make something that's available to everyone that is in many ways secure? Because that digital identity is really the key for people being able to either file their taxes or use it for anyone else. It's not as straightforward as it sounds. You don't just give everyone a number. How do you make that secure? Connected to that, and the next area that we're looking at very extensively is e-payments. Being able to do your payments online, being able to do your payments as you walk into stores, using cash a lot less. The third area is a smart nation sensor platform. Being able to pick up lampposts and things like that, give you new ideas, new data that feed into that whole sensor system for Singapore. The fourth, and this is important for a small city state that restricts the usage of cars, is urban mobility, smart urban mobility. We want to make it possible for people to go around the city quite easily using technology to choose the best way to get from point A to point B. And in fact, the target is to make no journey longer than 45 minutes from door to door. And the fifth area is your moments of life, sort of registration from the time you are born all the way through your life. What do you need to do in order to create a framework around these? And these 5 areas already take up the whole area around the smart nation. Now, in building up all this, we do need to enable a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship, including experimentation. So areas that we are looking at are things like open data, because many of these things cannot work unless you've got the data available to you. A living laboratory, how do you test out things in an area? And in this, in fact, we've become a test bed for many global multinationals to try out things like autonomous vehicles and fintech, because we want to be able to make sure that the regulation fits into the technology, not technology having to comply by current regulations. So we want to work with companies as they try many of these technologies out. Creating an industry and startup ecosystem. That's really for the people to sort of come up with the ideas. Cybersecurity, as my friend said, technology comes with certain risks. Cybersecurity and data privacy is another strong aspect of it. The computational capabilities and digital inclusion. Using our universities to build up that ability for people to be able to reach the higher levels of computational ability. And the final idea that we're working on, and this is an exciting idea, is a cross-border collaboration. In Southeast Asia, we have an organization of 10 called ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Countries. And last year we launched through Singapore an ASEAN Smart City Network that pulls together 26 cities in the region to collaborate much better on these areas. So it's not just about Singapore being a smart nation, it is creating a whole smart city framework around the region. Now there are challenges around this. One, obviously there's too much hype, and every technology that comes up, everyone wants to try and adopt it. We shouldn't just be chasing technology for technology. The next challenge is really how do you create more collaboration between government, within government, through society as well, and how do you co-create things? Not just having everything to be created in Singapore, but to create opportunities to create these things globally. Now the next plans are things like AI, that's a strategic capability, but in many of these things, we do need a whole-of-government approach, a whole-of-nation approach that comes with this. So this really outlines where we are in the smart nation, and thank you for letting me be here on this panel.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I would now give the floor to Minister Plenipotentiary in the Austrian Embassy, Clemens Mantel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me here on this distinguished panel. A few words on our office. It's called the Office of Science and Technology Austria, or OSTE. Horrible name, horrible abbreviation, acronym. But we are the Austrian government's one-stop shop for all things science, technology, and innovation in relation between Austria and the United Nations. I will tell you more or less the same what you heard already. I just tried to formulate it a little bit differently. And let me start off with admitting that as an Austrian government representative, I don't like to respond to emerging technologies. But we want, at least if we can't build them, initiate them, promote them, and scale them. And our understanding of digitization derives from a typical European ethos that government shouldn't relegate itself just to the job of the linesman. Our aspiration is to outline pathways of success to digital tomorrow. So you know all government always has been and is the foundation, as I call it, of emerging technologies. And it should also take the role as the team captain in a digital transformation. You all know the examples also here in the US. I don't have to quote Google and the autonomous driving here again. You know them, how they were initiated. And the handling of digitizations for us as a government, as has been already said, is not just about tools, efficiency, and effectiveness. It's also one of attitudes and values. Only because something is new, or wow, or innovative doesn't mean it's necessarily socially accepted or socially desirable. So the Austrian government set up a digital roadmap already in 2016, and it's built on this framework, or in this framework. It covers all relevant emerging technologies from our point of view, and it has 12 guiding principles that rest both on technical but also on social guidelines, and which are strictly or very strongly humane focused. And we realized lately also this holistic attitude towards upholding the value of sustainability and inclusiveness in digitized times like today, catch up also with other countries. I just read last week, I think New Zealand adopted its well-being budget and to bring digitization also under the umbrella of a concentrated sustainability. When I arrived here, 2015, 4 years ago, as European government representative, I have to admit I had to grow quite a thick skin here, because whenever you governments and legislators raise these questions about social costs of platforms, they always were dismissed, you're killing innovation, this is over-regulating, and you're a regulation monster in the European Union. But eventually, I think the fallback during the last couple of years proved that government needs to move on just to play a role and be part of the conversation. The role of politics is to give directions, also in the field of innovation, and to coordinate the moves of the stakeholders in this area. As I already said, government should act as a team player, and as such should also be a role model when it comes to smart government. At this point, I gladly commend the Estonian colleagues and the Estonian government because they have overtaken us in Europe when it comes to e-government. But we're proud, and we think that Austria was the one to put up its flag first a couple of years ago, developing creative e-government solutions. Back already in 1997, we founded the Austrian Federal Computing Center, which is a government agency for all digital affairs. And the idea was to embed the greatest technical talent in Austria for the Austrian government and in the Austrian government, and to build a market-leading technology for the public sector. It grew out of our government's self-awareness or self-understanding as a service provider for the Austrian citizens, because they have a right to a public service as an ease-of-use public service, just, as we like to say, just one click away. The center now boasts more than 1,200 employees already, and it helped to ramp pivotal projects in Austria in that respect. They created the e-card, digitizing all the health records of all the Austrians. So every single Austrian has an e-card with his health records. And whenever you attend a doctor, we always have the same e-card moving on. Lately, they built a virtual blockchain village and the internet, a webpage, where all city managers can go and visit and maybe get some inspirations of how blockchain can be applied for their communities when it comes to farming, when it comes to financing healthcare, etc. And all those projects, as I said already, are developed by this agency, by the center, either in-house completely or, of course, in cooperation with industry. Another good example of what government can do in this respect is called Data Rack. That's also an application of the center. Everybody's talking about GDPR, and this app helps especially SMEs to register and process all their activities. And it's automatically fully GDPR compliant, and it's free of charge for all the SMEs. Thus making us hopefully also those SMEs as a privacy leader globally. Apart from that, we always like to brag about Vienna as the smartest city in the world because it's continuously rated as the city or the capital with the best quality of life in the world. But we also are very much into smart manufacturing in Austria. The government supported so-called pilot factories, where research is done how new productions really work in Industry 4.0 on real products. And they're not just looking into this, but they're also training the workforce in Austria. And companies and industry can send their workers there to train and learn and teach them new production processes. And, well, they became extremely successful because they're generating even income now from international delegations, which have to pay quite a bit of money to get a tour there. Additionally to training workforce for emerging technologies in Austria, it's very important for us, of course, to teach and to create trust for those new technologies. The government recently established another agency called Digital Austria, and this agency has the sole objective to push and promote the new emerging technologies in Austria. But they also will set up a platform in the coming weeks of how to create trust for AI and the other technologies. Still, you might know also in Europe, I think 48% of the population doesn't know what an algorithm is. So we as government, as Austrian government, think or feel that we need to lay the groundwork here if we want to push forward with digital solutions without leaving parts of our population behind, as was already mentioned before. So the schism between big tech and the ordinary citizen is growing, is still there, and it won't go away by itself. So we as a government feel we have and we can close this chasm. I have to admit, and I'm a little bit embarrassed now, because there's one field in government that's still behind the curve when it comes to that, and it's my own field, it's diplomacy. We heard a lot of colleagues and presentations already today from the security and from the defense side, and you know they're way ahead of us in this respect. But I feel that's another story and it would take too long here to dwell on that. But anyway, to make my point, countries who are merely responding to emerging technologies, we're convinced will be second-tier consumers of first-tier technology and companies. So Austria, to close, is all about setting the pace for innovation and the digital transformation. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity here to highlight how we think this can be done, as we're also convinced that sometimes Adam Smith's invisible on our virtual hand might need a real hand from governments to level the playing field for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Mantil. I can, in all of our defense, perhaps say that a bit of an anecdote from our own department or ministry, if I can say. We like to point out to our colleagues in the defense side and say indeed they're very much on top of many things and have many fancy toys, but it's up to us in the departments of state and foreign ministries to have the sort of better quality people, if I may say, because that's what we have is people. And so rather than the fancy toys that some of the ministries do have. And with that, I would pass the baton to, last but not least, His Excellency Jonathan Suviev, the Ambassador of Estonia. Please, take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. And first of all, thank you all for being here and thank you for having us. And the challenge for me, obviously, as the sixth speaker on a six-person panel, is to say something that has not yet been said. And that's a hard job because almost every key word in my notes has been mentioned by my distinguished colleagues before me. But I'll start with a joke, and the joke is obviously stolen. It's stolen from the TV show Chernobyl. If you haven't seen it, you should. One of the best things on TV that I've seen. And it's a joke about the Soviet system. The Soviet regime was reminded by my Azerbaijani colleague, so I'm going to have to start with a joke about the Soviet system. So there are miners having a discussion amongst themselves, and one of them asks a question, and the question is, what do you think this is? It's a sort of a quiz question. It's a machine that makes a lot of noise, drinks a lot of oil, throws out sparks, smells really bad, and cuts apples into 3 pieces. What do you think this is? And nobody knows. And he says, well, it's a Soviet machine made for cutting apples into 4 pieces. And the thing I like about the show is that it's the first Western-made TV show that captures the essence of life in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Nothing is off. The phones they use are like the phones we used in the 1980s. The sinks, the cars, the clothes, everything. And I'm telling you this joke not only to kill time, because everything has been said before, but there is a point I'm trying to make here, which will reveal itself in a few minutes. So I'll tell you Estonia's story, real brief. What we have in Estonia, we think, is the world's first digital state, where innovation did not take place in the government because of the innovative technologies that the government uses, but because of the innovative way we have used technology that really is off the shelf. So what do? We do our taxis online, usually in less than 3 minutes. We do 99.8% of our bank transactions online. Most of citizen government interactions take place online. Nobody stands in a line. Nobody has to go to any government office. Before coming here last summer, I had to sell my car. Couldn't get a decent price from the dealership, so I put up an ad myself. Somebody called me, wanted to see my car. We met at a parking lot. He liked the car, and I decided to sell it to him because we had agreed on a price. So he took out his cell phone, I took out my cell phone. He wired me the money. I made a few other clicks in a government system. The title changed hands. I gave him the keys and had to call a taxi to get home. So no visits to the DMV, no visits to any government office. We actually even vote online. At European Parliament elections a few weeks ago, almost half of all votes that were cast in Estonia were cast online, digitally. Now, when I say online and digitally, it doesn't mean that a person showed up at a voting station somewhere and logged on to some government computer. When I say voted online, that means voted from their living room or from their summer cottage, on their cell phone, on their laptop, from their office, from wherever, by logging on to the government system and just casting the vote. We sign documents digitally in a legally binding manner, and all in all, this we think saves us roughly 5 days on average per person because we never stand in a line. We think it also saves us roughly 2% of GDP because of no papers filed, no time wasted. So this is the digital state that we have. How did we get here? This is where the anecdote from the Chernobyl becomes relevant. So after 50 years of brutal and unwanted Soviet occupation, we reemerged on the map in 1991. And we reemerge on the map in a situation where most people have no access to telephones. I mean landlines. The technology that we have is the technology that cuts apples into 3 pieces instead of cutting them into 4 pieces. And the desire is clear. We have lost 5 decades. We want to catch up. We want to catch up with the rest of Europe as fast as we possibly can. And we were lucky to have smart people who realized that the only way we can catch up is not by copying what our friends in Austria, for instance, have done for the past 50 years. The only way we can catch up is by leapfrogging, by taking advantage of the technology that was only emerging back then. We were lucky, not only in regaining independence, but in regaining independence at about the same time that the internet was becoming a thing. So we managed to bypass a number of legacy systems. No Estonian knows what a checkbook is. We just simply managed to bypass it. And that didn't only take place in the government. It was obviously the private sector that led us in that innovative use of the internet. What the government did, the really innovative thing that the government did, was I think 2 things. First, a digital ID. The idea is simple, it is not controversial. When an individual here in Washington, D.C. walks into a bank, wants to access his or her own money, before anything gets done, the bank asks you to identify yourself. And you identify yourself not by presenting a gas bill or your Facebook ID. You identify yourself by presenting a government-issued ID, a driver's license, a passport, whatever. This is a norm in the analog world. So our government decided in the 1990s that if indeed the internet is the next big thing, if indeed a lot of our business will move online, then the government ought to provide its citizenry with a secure government-guaranteed digital ID. The technology we use is not novel. It's a plastic card with a chip on it. And you as an individual have a PIN code, much like with your ATM card. But it's your digital ID that the government guarantees. The second thing that the government did was a data highway. We call it X-Roads, a data highway that connects government databases in a secure way so that data can flow. And then the government innovated in its legislation. I'll just give you 2 examples of what we did back in the 1990s. So one of the laws stipulates that when a government interacts with its citizens, it can ask a question only once. No matter which department talks to you, if a department asks you how much money you made last year, say it's the IRS, your tax board, then no government agency can ask that question again. If you have provided that data to the government ought to know it, and it's the government's business to then figure out how to move that information from department to department. That's where the data highway becomes critical. That's why our X-Road is so important. And that is why we can file our taxes in less than 3 minutes. More than that, that is what allows the government to push services towards the citizen. Say you had a baby. So the government knows that you had a baby, and the government asks you what the baby's name is, and so on and so forth. And they can only ask that question once. So you are no longer expected to file for, say, child support. If the 3rd child, the government already knows this is your 3rd child. And if you are entitled to special, additional child support because this is the 3rd child, again, the government already knows that. Is expected to push that towards you. And you are not expected to file or request additional services or additional child support because the government already has that data. Now, the second innovative thing that we did was we regulated that you are the owner of that data. It is not government owned, nor private company owned. The citizen is in charge of that and it is the owner of all data that concern that person. That means that if you so desire, you can turn it off. If you do not want the different government agencies to know what you have, you can turn it off. You can log online and you will lose some of the benefits that others can use. You can turn it off, and you can also see which ones of the government agencies have accessed your data. So every time I, for instance, am interested, I can log on and there's a list of, be it, say, police or IRS or citizenry board that have accessed my data. That is important because all of this is dependent upon the citizen trusting the government with that critical data. So what has made it possible? I'll tell you really briefly. When you give a citizen a card, the ID card and a PIN code, and if it's just the government that is online, what will happen, I will guarantee you this, is that the person will lose the card and will forget the PIN code. Because most often citizens interact with the government once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times a year. And if there is a service that you provide that a person only uses 3 times a year, they will lose the card and they will forget the PIN code. The only way this does not happen is if the private sector starts using the same infrastructure. So again, going back to the beginning, when you walk into a private company here in the United States, you want to identify yourself, you present the driver's license that the state issued you. So when you log on to your bank account, why is it that you use the bank's own identification system? What happened in Estonia was that the banks decided very early on that it is safer and much cheaper for them to use the government ID card as a log-on, as opposed to creating their own systems. So the banks, the telecommunications companies, other companies started using the government ID card as a way to identify their customers. So now all of a sudden, when I want to check my water bill, which I did this morning, I don't use the water company's log-on information. I use my government ID and that PIN code. When I want to log on to my bank account, which I also did today because I had to pay my water bill, I use my government ID and that PIN code. When I want to sign documents, which I did this morning because I was unhappy with my water bill, because they had made a mistake and I had to file a petition, I signed it digitally using that government ID and the government issued PIN code. So I use my government ID every single day, 90% of the times, not to interact with the government, but to interact with private companies. All in all, again, I think roughly on average, 5 days saved and 2% of GDP money-wise. So why do we do it? We do it to save time, to not stand in lines, and to save money. Now, very, very finally, 2 things that often, or 2 questions that are often asked. What about privacy? And what about security? Both are crucial building blocks because all of this is dependent upon trust, privacy and security. Is it private and is it secure? Well, first of all, depending on the context, the answer usually is, well, of course not. Of course not. It's not 100%. But is it as secure or even more secure than the alternative analog way of doing business? Yes, absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. The most private information that any individual usually has is your medical information. Now in Estonia, all of that is in digital form. All of it. Even when I visit my private doctor, the medicine he or she prescribes, everything is digital. As opposed to in an analog world, having a paper file in that doctor's office. My file, which is in digital form, leaves, or in my case, if somebody accesses my data, it leaves a log. There is information that stays behind. When somebody takes a photo of my paper file, then I have no way of knowing it before it's leaked out into the press. Is it secure? Well, it's more secure than the analog world. Is it private? It's more private than in the analog world. How can we be sure? Well, it's because the government is pretty transparent. When we've had issues regarding security, we have always made those issues public. When we get the question of is it 100%, we always give the honest answer of no. But do we trust it? Yes, we do. And a good example of us trusting it is the 99.8% of bank transactions that take place online, or the close to 50% of votes. 50% of votes that were cast online during past European Parliament elections. Now, are we as people maybe more trusting? No, absolutely. Having coming through the Soviet occupation and being very private people as individuals, the fact that we believe in this system is a good example of the system itself being trustworthy. So since we have limitations of time, I can't go on forever, but for all who are interested in how to do this, welcome to Estonia. Come visit us, check it out. It's real, it exists, and it has worked for more than 10 years now. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. There's a microphone going around. Questions?
Hey, this is Masanabe. If I do remember well, Estonia was the first country that was a victim of a cyber attack, I think from Russia, a few years ago. Do you think that the fact that your government moved to a centralized electronic database made your country more vulnerable?
Well, in 2007, what happened in Estonia was really the first major cyber attack, at least an attack that made cyber famous. And I remember I was back then stationed here at our embassy, not as ambassador, but as a diplomat responsible for political affairs. And I remember how difficult it was to convince politicians or even officials here that something significant was happening. Because cyber attack, it sounded as if it were from a sci-fi movie. So the first effort was to convince people that no, this is really real. We've come a long way since those days. Estonia's digital infrastructure is very far from being centralized. Nothing is centralized. That is the first thing that I think makes us more secure. Secondly, the data that is so crucial for our functioning is not only housed in Estonia. We have, partly because of the experiences of 2007, initiated what we call cyber embassies or digital embassies, where we duplicate data that is crucial overseas, in Luxembourg to a large extent, but also in other places. So that if we were to lose access to data domestically because of an attack, or maybe just losing electricity for a week, we have a backup overseas. And some of the data that is really crucial, for instance, is data on land ownership. You know, who owns what piece of real estate. None of this exists in paper form in Estonia anymore. So making sure that we have that backed up is obviously a crucial national security issue. We also learned back in 2007 that the internet really is international and that you cannot defend yourself if the only thing that's defending you is your own government. Yes, of course, we need whole of government, we need whole of society, we need the telecommunications companies to play along, the banks to play along, but none of this takes place within Estonia. It requires international cooperation. And international cooperation has to be regulated, which is why since 2007 especially, we have put such a huge emphasis on the work that we do on international law, so that people would understand that much like if you break a rule in an analog world, if you break into a bank, you rob a bank with a weapon, there's a good likelihood that you will be caught and punished. People need to be aware that the digital world is not different. if you break into a bank or wage war on a country, there will be ramifications. There will be, you will be caught, and you will have to answer for what you did. So making sure that people demystify digital has been part of what we've done. Today we're pretty confident that we are well defended, that the alliances that we have are functioning, that international law applies to the cyber world, and that the attack against us in 2007 did not work out well for those who attacked us. And that, by the way, is the crucial thing. So it is not the computer that attacks you. There is a human being pushing buttons, making decisions behind any cyber attack. And if we want to avoid cyber attacks, or if we want to make sure they do not succeed, then it is that decision maker whose cost-benefit analysis we need to effect. It has nothing to do with technology, has really nothing to do with computers or the internet, has to do with affecting that person's cost-benefit analysis. If that person thinks that he or she can get away with it, if we are having trouble with attributing the attack, then obviously his cost-benefit analysis will lead him to continue these attacks. If he, however, believes that he will get caught, and he will, and if he believes that the outcome of the attack will leave him in a worse place than from where he started, then we have a good, then we're in a good place to deter him.
Thank you, Excellency. I think that we might be running up against the time.
One last
One
question
more
or
question?
time, or
One more?
calling? Oh, do we, one more?
Okay.
It's up to you. Yeah, do we have time for one more, or? Yes? Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Question?
thank you. I was just curious about, in Singapore, the Smart Nation sensor platform. Could you expand a little bit upon what technology that specifically includes and where the data from that will be used?
Thank you. Essentially, the first thing we're working with are lampposts, because they are most ubiquitous everywhere, but they also then fit back into the whole idea of mobility and traffic. And that's really where we're trying to get that technology in, so that because we are such a small city, we need to have people moving quite easily around. Once you put these sensors into these lampposts, you're getting a better sense of traffic movements, and including where and how you can make adjustments as necessary. We actually have electronic road pricing in Singapore that adjusts the price based on different timings. And you can then use that data to say, we can anticipate that between 8 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. there's going to be a lot of traffic, we can raise the price. From midnight to 6 a.m. there's very little traffic, you can have a toll-free sort of travel. So the main area at the moment now is largely for mobility, to make sure that it all is connected better and make sure that people get able to move around the city a lot better. That's just the first phase. The next areas will include things like the air quality. You can then start taking in, do we have poor air quality? Do you then want people that may be having an illness or an asthma to avoid going outdoors? By having a sort of citywide sensor network, you're able to pick up a lot more information, sometimes more specific for different parts of the city as well. So that's the initial use of many of these sensors.
Thank you, Excellency. With that, I think I would ask our colleagues to, everybody here to give a big hand for our ambassador's panel.